Hello and welcome to the Temple Mount Podcast. My name is Shogun. Joining me today is my friend Eggbased, and we are going to have a discussion about bipolar disorder, living with bipolar disorder, experiences around living with bipolar disorder. Make sure you join us on the Temple Mount Discord server and find our YouTube and BitChute channels, Temple Mount Podcast, Temple Mount Official. That being said, welcome Eggbased. Thanks for joining me. How are you today, sir?
Hello, I'm quite well, sir. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So I don't know 100% what direction you'd like to go, but I know that you have recently been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and you've had some experiences around that. As you know, I've been living with the same diagnosis since, for about 6 years. So I'm sure we have a lot to talk about, a lot of angles to kind of approach it. Where would you like to start? Do you want to talk about in general terms, or do you want to tell a bit about your experiences?
Well, so I'm actually going to sort of lean on your experience as a podcast host. As you know, or may know, I've had my own podcast periodically, but so I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in August of this year, and it's now November, coming up on mid-November. And I got out on Friday, so about 2.5 weeks from late October to early November, I was, choose a word, enrolled or imprisoned, I suppose, in an inpatient facility dealing with mental illness. And I was, for the record, the most lucid and relatively sane person at this facility. And as a result, it was a interesting, if not traumatic, experience for me. So I was diagnosed in August. I then fled the country and spent 2 months in Canada. And then upon coming back, within 24 hours, I had enrolled myself in this inpatient facility to receive medication for my earlier diagnosis. So we can start wherever you like.
Sure. So when you say you fled the country, do you mean that in a literal way, in the sense that part of your reason for leaving the country was to, get away from being diagnosed or the diagnosis? Or were you kind of joking about, I was just wondering how literal that was. Was that part of the reason you went to Canada?
Yeah, no, certainly. So, I suppose subconsciously it may have been one thing or another, but the primary reason for my having left the United States was that the woman I love and have been in a relationship with for some 2.5 years is in Vancouver. So I went there, and of course, while I was there, I saw a great many sights and met a great many people, including no less an encounter with our very own Crimson Raven and Creatrix, which was very rewarding. You're going to have to pardon my congestion, but no, I don't think it was fleeing the country in any sort of sense as one such criminal may put it, or the such like. But
right. So you're going to visit your girlfriend, not because of the diagnosis, but you received the diagnosis shortly before you went, and then if I understand the timeline, you were sort of you had a good visit, you had a good time, like you say, you met up with some server members in Canada, and then did the sort of manic episode phase begin when you got back home?
No. So interestingly, the manic episode began in sometime around June and proceeded through August, and I would argue that rather than the traditional come down from the manic episode, the presence of, again, this woman with whom I am so in love prevented me from having the traditional come down from the manic episode, which I would argue is mostly, in most cases, similar to the come down from MDMA. It's something like Suicide Tuesday. but my come down from my manic episode was abated by the presence of both a strong social requirement for stability and also the presence of this my significant other, who is no less than saving grace. However, the moment I returned, my mental health had almost instantly deteriorated, as if it were on the plane, per se. And as a result, my father picked me up from the airport and drove me to a local counseling center, where I was then admitted to the behavioral health hospital. So that's the official timeline as it stands.
Right. Okay. So I think, sometimes it's interesting to recount as much as you want to about the actual manic episode itself, right? So you had gotten the diagnosis. So do you have a specific time in your mind where you could kind of say the manic episodes started for you, and like what that was like, or what that felt like? And
Yeah,
also,
so
it's your first time having a manic episode, as far as you know.
So I would say that it wasn't my first, but it was the first time having what might be clinically called a manic episode, and what I mean by that is that, perhaps at some point I had had episodes which might be called mania. But this was, as in this most recent one, was certainly an expression of bipolar disorder, as would be easily recognized by, say, a psychiatrist, etc. So I was working in outside sales at the time and was endowed with a great number of five-figure paychecks. And I got a particularly large one in June. I think it was some $37,500 US. And that instantly triggered all sorts of lavish spending, etc. But so my girlfriend was there from late April to about the middle of May, around my birthday, which is May 19th. And after she left, that was when it really began. And I think it was actually her leaving which triggered it. And I spent something like $110,000 in less than 2 weeks. So that was the indication to me personally that I had bipolar disorder. And I self-diagnosed at that point. And then upon my having spent all the way down to my last dime and lost my housing, that was when I actually submitted to the mental health establishment, which diagnosed me in August. And shortly after that, somewhat for not having a place to stay, but also for needing some emotional support, I went to Vancouver. I took the train, by the way, from Boston to Seattle, across the entire United States, to see my girlfriend and meet her parents in Seattle. And then we drove across the border to Vancouver, and I helped her move in. But yeah, I did certainly have a manic episode and was diagnosed and given Lamictal at the time at a starter dose, which only treats bipolar depression. So in June, I had the manic episode. In August, I was diagnosed, but it wasn't until about the middle to end of September. Rather the middle to end of October that I actually received lithium, which was the medication for the mania. So.
Right. Yeah, certainly lavish or reckless spending is definitely a symptom of mania that I've experienced more than once myself. It can be pretty catastrophic sometimes. I'm really sorry to hear that. I know how hard that is. You don't have to say any more than you want to, or say as much as little as you want to, but do you want to describe anything about, how you spent that money or what you were doing during that time? Hopefully you at least had a great time.
Yeah, no, I certainly enjoyed myself, and unfortunately, I have very little show of it. But I spent an entire month staying in a suite at the Ritz-Carlton. I ate every night at some of the most lavish restaurants available to me in my local area of Boston. I consumed a great many very expensive substances. Interestingly, contrary to most bipolar patients, did not spend any money on prostitutes, mostly out of faith to my relationship. However, I did spend a great amount on other people, and buying them drinks and such, and having conversations with them, and picking up their tabs for their time, etc. And surprisingly, I think that I garnered a great amount of life experience and learned to appreciate a whole class of goods and services which is otherwise unavailable to people of my state or class, and is generally only available to the profoundly rich. But because I was spending so much fucking money, I was able to participate in that lifestyle. So that was mostly how I spent it.
Understood. And I think you mentioned at one point there was a car crash as well. Do you think that was part of it, like, or connected to the manic episode, or was that unrelated in your opinion?
Well, so interestingly enough, so for the record, at the time I was driving a 2007 Honda CR-V EXL, and I was traveling home from Connecticut, having visited my mother. And it was about 11:30 at night. I was going 74 miles an hour, and this summary bastard in a white Toyota Camry. So you can imagine the sort of man who drives a white Toyota Camry, or woman, I suppose, but I thought it was a man. He was going about 95 miles an hour, and I was in the middle lane. He was in the right lane, going 95. And he decided all of a sudden that he would like to move to the middle lane. And of course, because he was going 95 miles an hour, he didn't have the requisite reaction time or mental faculties to notice my presence in the middle lane. So he tapped my left bumper, which caused my vehicle to steer right. I countered left and overcorrected, which caused me to crash into the Jersey barrier in the middle of the highway, and then turn backwards. And I actually performed a J-turn and did the full 360 degrees to turn forwards and pulled the vehicle over into the shoulder. It was a total loss, but the insurance company ruled not at fault, and I got about 87% of the money that I'd paid for the car back. So to answer your question more directly, while I don't believe that it was directly related to the manic episode, I do believe that it significantly contributed to the manic episode. Because, of course, the loss of my car prevented me from doing such things as going out to my sales territories, keeping my sales calls, and as a result, I basically resigned my job, which involved a great deal of travel, and in so doing, opened both my calendar and my mental state up to a great deal of lavish pursuits, which were not so profitable as I said, lavish or extra. I suppose.
Hmm. Extravagant, yeah. So, other than the excessive spending or the reckless spending, did you notice any other symptoms of bipolar or of mania, such as extreme euphoria, excessive confidence, feelings of invincibility? Sometimes people get insomnia; they don't sleep for a long time. Sometimes people start experiencing psychosis or delusions. Like, what was your experience like? Was there other symptoms other than spending?
Well, it's the next logical question, of course, and I have a great appreciation for the fact that many bipolar patients suffer from things such as psychosis, but I'm lucky enough that that at least has not been the case so far, and I pray to God that it will not be. But I suppose at the time I believed myself rather irrationally to be sort of capable, if not destined, to live sort of the life of Riley. And I believed that spending all of this money was more than reasonable. It was, in fact, good. And I suppose, insofar as I did that, you could consider it to be a state of psychosis. I think the first marker of my manic episode, though, was that my smoking tripled. I went from 5 to 10 a day to 35 to 40 a day. And that, I suppose, was the most profound and readily quantifiable change. But the others, for instance, I purchased some 6 custom-tailored suits in addition to the 3 I already possessed. I spent a lot of money at Brooks Brothers, and I had a very nice line of credit at the time. I believe my credit score was about 792 at its peak. And I maxed out every credit card that I had. And in the sort of come down, you might say, I paid most of them off. I still have about $1,500 in credit card debt, but it's well below my limit and is not accumulating significant interest. So, no to psychosis, yes to delusions of grandeur. And I did have some profound, or at least I thought they were profound, spiritual experiences. And, quote, revelations, unquote, which I recorded, which I wrote down, some were in the form of poetry, others in the form of long-form essays, some of which could qualify themselves as entire business plans or white papers for patent publication. So I wouldn't call it wasteful necessarily, but yes, there were certainly the benchmarks of a typical manic episode. Interestingly, the profile photo that I have here of myself in a 3-piece suit wearing a sort of what do you call it? A full-length coat, like a 3/4 overcoat, etc. That photo was taken during a manic episode, and that was the typical outfit that I would wear even when going to mid-range bars. And that was, of course, another marker of the manic episode, is the fact that I was wearing a 3-piece suit and tie to go and have a $14 cocktail at some local bar.
Right. So you mentioned the spiritual experiences. So this is usually one of the hardest parts to explain or describe. But can you do anything to kind of give context around those spiritual experiences? What happened from your point of view? How you interpret it?
Well, certainly I can attempt to do so. I must, of course, first make the disclaimer that lithium carbonate is significantly impeding my intellect. Whether or not that's readily apparent is a separate issue, but to me, of course, it is. My memory is usually extensive and readily available, whereas since the beginning of my lithium regimen, it has not been. What I will say is that I believed wholeheartedly that I was more in the presence of God than I had ever been, and that the things that I was experiencing were almost a sort of test, such that I was to experience them later in life, and that my moral righteousness and or rectitude, I suppose, were being tested in these lavish environments, where I readily met individuals who were, millionaires by Machiavellian means, of course. And I felt as though I was being exposed to a part of the world which I would later be either responsible for or quite regularly exposed to, and that these experiences were sort of testing my ability to withstand this sort of environment and still be the person who I am genuinely. And whether or not that is a delusion related to mania or a significant spiritual insight, I know not. At the time, I believed it to be the latter. Presently, I could be convinced of either one.
So the impression you had was that you were either exposing yourself to necessary experiences or being guided to have these experiences in order to prepare you for some eventual destiny that would require that or involve that.
Yes, and yes, and I believed more specifically that I was at some point destined to be either rich or readily in the company of the rich, and that these experiences were sort of, if not training me, then testing me for that future experience. That is to say, for instance, if we put this guy in the most expensive steakhouse in Boston or some, Michelin star restaurant, or if we put him in a suite at the Ritz-Carlton for a month and everyone well knows that he has 10 suits regularly available from the en-suite dry cleaner, and he frequently orders very expensive scotch at the bar and room service, etc. Is he going to surrender his morals or not? And I think it could merely be a grandiose conclusion, or in fact a full-on delusion from said manic episode, that I was being either tested or prepared for some future success in which I would be required to maintain my composure and moral uprightness during such a period of success.
So when you say like that question, what will he do when he's in this situation or that situation? Who did you think was asking that question? Was it God or was it, some other entity or both?
Well, I had a chronic headache condition from the age of 12 to the age of 19, during which time I would read the book of Job repeatedly. I would chain smoke Job. I would read front to back, and the minute I finished it, I would restart. And I wouldn't presume to say that my own personhood, even at the time, I wouldn't presume to say that my own personhood was worthy of a wager between God and Satan. But I did wonder.
About a wager between God and Satan? Like there was an element of that dynamic in your experience, you mean?
Yeah, I suppose so. More of I believe that while it is entirely possible for one to be tested directly by God himself. It is also merely a fact of the world and its rules and the way in which it subjects people that you are tested, through a series of initiations or hierarchical steps per se. And I thought as though it was a sort of proving ground where I had this money and I had decided in my manic state that it was going to be expended. And the test was, what am I going to do with it? Am I going to, like you could walk up to a homeless person and offer him $1,000 to beat the shit out of him. Or, like for $100,000, I could have spent many weeks with some of the best hookers in the nation. And, did I do it? No. Could I have done it? Yes. Do I believe that it proves my moral character, that I avoided such things despite having full knowledge and awareness of them? Somewhat.
Right. So I think you said you expended like $100,000 within 2.5 weeks. Is that correct, or was that over a more extended period of time? Because I think you said you stayed at the Ritz-Carlton for like a month. So was that the last 100,000 out of a greater sum, or was that the total duration? I'm just trying to how over what period of time did you expend what amount of money by your estimation? If you're
So, I actually haven't done up the receipts, mostly because I don't, frankly, want to know. But I cleared my tax return for 2022 was about $378,000, and I spent literally every last fucking cent of it, with notwithstanding my contributions to my Roth and traditional IRA, the amount I tied up in stocks, the amount I sent to my parents as reparations for some money they'd lent me during less profitable times, and buying a car, payments on insurance, rent, etc. The rest of it was recklessly expended. So basically, outside of paying everything that I had to pay, I think it was in excess of $250,000. But there were 2 weeks in which I spent about $110,000. Now, it does bear some saying that despite the typical expression of bipolar disorder, I gambled very little, and my gambling career is currently about $37,000 in the black. So most of this spending was on either material goods or services, none of which I have to show, save the wardrobe, the suitcases, various souvenirs, things like that. But no BMW or anything.
right. Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, I can relate to a lot of different aspects of your experience, and it's amazing when you're having a manic episode, the ability to spend without accumulating, and it's like an extraordinary thing. This is one of the stranger aspects of the condition. I was going to ask, how was your sleep during this whole period of time? Like, were you sleeping normally? Were you not sleeping at all?
Well, frankly, there was a lot of cocaine involved, so I was sleeping polyphasically for about half of it, and was sleeping almost not at all for the other half. I'd be up for 2-3 days, and then I'd sleep, haphazardly for some number of hours, which I never really kept track of. And then so that 2 or 3 days no sleep, and then the fourth day there would be some amount of sleep, and then 5, 6 there'd be no sleep at all, etc. And I actually was very proud of my ability to go without sleep, to the degree that while I was beginning to be manic and still working my job, I was actually proud of the fact that not only could I not sleep, but I could then get up and drive to my various territories across multiple states and close deals. So I believed it to be some sort of superpower at that time. But for instance, at the Ritz, I slept very little. And interestingly enough, when it was sort of the middle of the night and there was nothing to be done, the clubs close in Boston around 2 a.m., I would sit in my room and play games on my phone, which I thought was just the funniest thing. And, if you spend hundreds of dollars, you can pretty much be the fucking king of any game on your phone, which is just fascinating. So I had a great deal of fun aggravating the hordes and denizens of mobile gaming, often in the wee hours of the morning.
Right. So, wow. I mean, was there any other stories or things you wanted to recount from that period of time when you're having the manic episode, when you're spending the money, before we move on to maybe another subject?
Yeah, so actually the reason I wanted to have this podcast was to speak about my experience in the inpatient facility, which, by the way, I was only liberated from this past Friday. And I understand that a great deal of our fellow members here at Temple Mount have experienced such a facility at least once, presumably including yourself, Shogun. And I sort of wanted to construe that positively. But there are also a great deal of negative experiences I had in such a place. So we can take that in whichever direction you prefer, or not at all.
Well, that was going to be the next area I went into, was your experience with being hospitalized and your experience inside the hospital. But I just wanted to see if there was any more, details or context that you wanted to share from the preceding period, which I just wanted to get into, because some people might not really know what a manic episode is, or what kind of problems it can cause, or how, serious the consequences can be. So I think that definitely puts into context, of where you were at when the hospitalization occurred. I guess one question, and yes, I have been in the hospital. The first time I was in the hospital was when I was like 18 or 19. And since then, there was a long period when I was not in the hospital for like 10 years or so. And then in the last 6 years, I've been in the hospital multiple times, to the point that I'm actually not even entirely clear how many times. Because at least for me, my memory gets pretty fried when I have manic episodes. But you're right. Yeah, many people in our community live with various mental health diagnoses, as you know. And I'd say, at least half of the people here, close to that, have probably spent some time in the hospital. And it's definitely a unique and interesting experience. So the first question I had was your hospitalization like voluntary or involuntary? That's like a formal term they use, but I more meant so, did you choose to go yourself, or was it family or friends who made the call for you?
Absolutely. So I got home from Vancouver on a Monday morning, and I had my dad drive me directly to a community counseling center. They put me in an emergency room overnight, and the next day I was admitted to an inpatient facility. So it was entirely voluntary. I practically requested it from the counseling center, and then I signed into the inpatient facility and was adamant that both before and after my admission that I was there to receive medication, and that it was the most expedient route, therefore, to do. So it was entirely voluntary, and most of the staff, if not all of them, concurred that I was the most sane and lucid patient on the unit, which turned out to be rather beneficial. But certainly I was there of my own volition, and certainly, as usual, I was admitted to a place far beyond my needs, as you can imagine.
Far beyond your needs. What do you mean by that? Like it was very nice, or like
No.
or you mean it was serious
I was sent to a place that somewhat resembled a prison with rounded off doorknobs, and even the fucking toilet paper holder was spring loaded to about 4 newtons, and 15-minute checks, etc., etc. So I voluntarily submitted myself to the mental health establishment, and they sent me to like the locked priority ward of some of the state's most insane. Not the violent insane, but you know, in there were most of the uncontactable schizophrenics, the people who remain in bed for the entire day without change at all, and you know, where they confiscate your shoelaces, etc. Which I did not need, for I was never a risk of homicide or suicide. I was merely a manic bipolar individual. And there's much more to be said, but I'll sort of follow your line of inquiry.
Yeah, it can be pretty surprising, I guess, if most people have never been in a psych ward, and a lot of people, I don't know what people think, but people often think, oh, it's going to be this nice, like, therapeutic hospital where you sort of get, you know, good counseling and some kind of therapeutic environment. And unfortunately, at least in my experience, that's usually not the case. Like you said, it's more like being in some kind of terrible prison-like environment, and yeah, they'll take your shoes away and all this kind of stuff. And you know, I understand that it's like they're trying to avoid liability by having people potentially harm themselves, but it's a strange paradox of the mental health system, that our idea is that if someone is experiencing some kind of mental health disturbance, the best thing is going to be to put them in this like terribly dystopian or unpleasant environment surrounded by other people who are potentially much more sick than they are, and who are also going through mental health disturbances, because you know, in reality, that can be very extremely destabilizing and make things a lot worse. You know, I understand that you weren't in psychosis, but if you are in psychosis and you happen to be locked up with a bunch of other people in psychosis, everybody seems like they're talking in code, and everybody's saying all these bizarre things and doing all these bizarre things. People start kind of connecting to each other's psychosis, and it becomes this weird, very surreal experience a lot of the time.
Yeah, and so this was precisely my experience, is that while I was not in a psychotic state at the time, and you know, the staff were all very, very wonderful, stable individuals who were rather sociable and, as I said, very pleasant. Most of the patients were on a level that I simply could not access or understand. And I was there for some 2.5 weeks. And as a result, by about the end of the second week, I had begun to be dragged down into some of it, and found myself psychically resisting the influence of being surrounded constantly by the cripplingly insane. And at some point, right after those 2 weeks had ended, but about 2 days before my departure therefrom, I actually broke down crying with one of the staff, because it was far too much. And there were a number of people, I would say about 30 or 40% of the patients were bipolar. And most of them insisted, one, that I should never take my medication, and two, that they did not, in fact, have bipolar disorder. And three, all sorts of things like that, God was evil or what have you. So to be surrounded by others in far greater and more, what's the word? More disturbing states of mania than myself. It was both an inspiration and a light, and a disturbing foresight into what may lie ahead for me.
Right. Yeah. But you had the experience during your mania of sort of experiencing, like, you maybe had some special destiny, the sort of a sense of a mission or being tested. We use the term spiral code here to refer generally to an altered state of consciousness, like a manic episode or a psychosis episode. But it's also characterized by like noticing a lot of coincidences or feeling like the universe is communicating to you, or people around you are saying or doing things that are very relevant to your experience or what you're thinking about. Like, does that correspond to your experience at all, or not so much? Basically, that sense of noticing a lot of synchronicities, feeling like you're being guided to do certain things.
No, I understand. I feel that way near constantly in a sort of benign sense, wherein it does not govern my life, but I do take notice of it. What's interesting to me is that having heard you speak on that prior to my hospitalization, I did speak to a few of the extremely manic individuals who were precisely psychotic, and asked them if they were experiencing such things, spirals, etc., and found that invariably the answer was yes. Now, I myself was able to, partially, I believe, due to my compliance with the regimen of medication, able to avoid such debilitating reliance on those perceived synchronicities, etc. But I do carry them throughout my life, and find that all things are sort of governed by a universal principle, which I think is more respectable and universal a hermeticism than the mere psychosis of, it's all connected, man, or God is talking to me through the television, and things like that. I think there's a fine line.
So just a few sort of a few mundane questions. Was there an exercise area in the hospital you were in? Did they have a weight room or an exercise room or anything like that?
No, certainly not. But we were allowed outside for 2 30-minute periods per day. And I had found a rather sturdy branch on a tree in the courtyard where I could get my lats in. I did push-ups in the grass. And then there was a circular path for which to walk, I suppose, which I would regularly run on. And then there were a couple of bipolar patients in the unit who were actually decent at, kicking the soccer ball around or throwing the football. And so we would do such things. And it allowed me to not only break a sweat, but also to get a well-rounded regimen of exercise in.
That's good. And I think I mentioned that when I'm in the hospital, I usually do a lot of Bible reading. I think you mentioned you did that as well. Did you take anything particular out of that, or were there particular parts of the Bible you were reading a lot at that time?
I was mostly reading Psalms, and while I, in my current state, having been tired, and I did take my evening medication at 10 o'clock. I didn't take any of my night-night pills per se, but um, the interesting thing about reading the Bible is that there were 2 or 3 practicing Catholics there who would join me, and I would read the Bible out loud. And I would read them the Gospel of John, of course, because anyone who hasn't read the Bible should, of course, read the Gospel of John, or the Gospel according to John. And but I personally, in my spare time, was reading Psalms. I was also reading a book on Freemasonry, which I found to be very intellectually engaging as well.
I see. And were there any other experiences or observations from the psych ward itself you wanted to share or talk about?
Yes, well, the interesting thing about psychological wards is that most of the nurses are hilariously attractive, and 2 or 3 of them had actually either approached or directly propositioned me. And of course, I made a great point of, calling my girlfriend and mentioning her and speaking about her during groups and things. But the way in which patients interacted with the staff was just fascinating to me. Like there was one like hilariously attractive charge nurse who really should be, on Sports Illustrated or something, and she seemed to be rather bothered by the fact that all of the young men who were admitted to that ward stared at her. But she had no problems speaking to me about her personal life, etc. And I was sort of fascinated by this prospect, right? That, you have these astounding young women who work in this particular field, and they frequently just sit about and expose themselves in very tightly fitting clothes to profoundly mentally ill young men who have no privacy and no ability to contact any other women. And I couldn't make heads or tails of it, really, to tell you the truth. I think someone in a greater psychotic state might say that it was a sort of temptation, but I believed no such thing and was merely fascinated by it.
And during the whole period of time when you were in the hospital, you didn't have access to any phones or computers. Is that correct?
I had access to what could be compared to a payphone. The hospital considered it a human right to place phone calls. So I was able to call, my father and my mother and my best friend and my girlfriend, and my mentor in Freemasonry and people like that. And I spoke to them on a regular basis via the hospital phones. The patient phones also had receiving numbers. So it was almost as though it was one of those like old-fashioned apartment buildings, where someone would knock on the door and say, phone, and leave the receiver hanging by a wire. And that was the case. So, no, I was able to contact the outside world, but only by dialing a rather primitive sort of phone. I had no access to the internet. I left my phone, watch, ring, most of my valuables with my father. And of course, none of them would have been available to me inside.
Right. So, having all this experience and looking back on it now, the question I have is, do you think being in the hospital was necessary, and more to the point, was it helpful? Or looking back, if you had the choice, would you have just gone on the medication and avoided the hospitalization if that had been an option? Like, do you feel like there was a way in which you needed to go to the hospital or that helped you? Or looking back, would you say, man, I probably could have passed that, skip that whole experience altogether? Like,
Sure. Well, first, the reason I went there was because I knew how the establishment worked, and I knew that if I wanted to meet with a psychiatrist, I would have to go to a therapist for some 3 weeks, and then get an appointment with a psychiatrist, which may be 1 or 2 months out. Whereas now, I went to this hospital, got a finely tailored regimen of medication, which has been changed some 6 times while I was there. And then, upon my discharge, received a series of follow-up appointments, the first of which is tomorrow, and the second of which is the day after. So I do believe that it was entirely necessary for my expedient treatment. And moreover, I believe that the experience I had there, while traumatizing, was in fact very helpful.
That's good. And I mean, I guess that more or less brings me to the end of my questions about the hospital and the preceding experience. We can open it up for audience questions. I'm wondering, do you want to talk at all about medication first?
Sure. I actually would love to speak about that subject, especially with you. So I am presently on 3 scheduled medications and 2 PRNs. I'm on Lamictal, lithium, and propranolol, and then I have a PRN prescription for trazodone and Ativan. So for those of you who don't know, Lamictal treats bipolar depression. Propranolol is a beta blocker, which is prescribed to me to treat the tremors caused by lithium. Lithium carbonate is a medication instrumental in the treatment of bipolar, which generally abates bipolar mania. And then my 2 PRNs are Ativan, which is a benzodiazepine for anxiety. Anxiety is not previously something that I exhibited, but during my stay at the hospital, I gained a thorough appreciation for my ability to be anxious. And then trazodone is a it's an antidepressant which functions very poorly as an antidepressant, but which does put people very soundly to sleep. So I have 3 prescriptions regularly and 2 as needed. And I assert that Lamictal is one of the better medications in the world. It makes me, there's a sick pit in my stomach, which I used to try and drink away or snort away or have sex to ameliorate, and never could. And Lamictal takes it away, which is a fascinating thing, which I'm very grateful for on a daily basis. Lithium, however, I think is sort of a zombie drug. It's this Faustian bargain between being a psychotic genius and having most of your intellect stripped away in order to be stable and functioning. I take it nonetheless because my practitioners are eventually going to lower it to a dose which I believe will be tolerable. And also because I don't think that I actually need to be profoundly intelligent in order to be significant as an individual, and that I would rather be incapable of hurting the ones that I love. So that's my spiel on medication, as it were.
Yeah, thank you. That kind of gets right to the heart of it, and you called it a Faustian bargain. That makes sense. I often just describe it as being sort of between a rock and a hard place for a lot of mentally ill people, bipolar people in specific, in a sense, because, like you said, it's sort of this catch-22 choice between, quote unquote stability, which is not really the same thing as wellness, but is what they're basically calling wellness, is just stability, right? Versus the sometimes massive consequences for cognition and for, for me, that was one of the most disturbing things, because traditionally I've been quite articulate. It's arguably decreasing a little bit as time goes on, but certainly when I was on antipsychotic medication, I literally couldn't speak on some of them. I'd be slurring my words, and it's very, hard to explain how kind of disturbing it is when you go on antipsychotics that impair your thinking and your ability to sometimes even feel emotions. So yeah, we're kind of left in this difficult choice of, do you want to feel clean and clear and sharp and have access to your creative and intellectual gifts, or do you want to make sure that you minimize the chance of having another catastrophic and super destabilizing episode, right? And there's no easy answer to that. And a lot of people go on and off medications and in and out of the hospital. And yeah, so I really appreciate you sharing everything you did about your experience, about the hospital, about the medication. Certainly, I have an almost infinite amount I could say about this subject, and I'm happy to share more about my experience. But I appreciate you sharing yours. What do you think? Should we open it up for audience questions now, or?
Well, yes, thank you, and I appreciate both your having hosted us here, and I anticipate that we'll have a great many interesting conversations on the subject in the future. I am more than happy to remain and answer as many questions as the audience would pose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've barely scratched the surface here. If there's any interest, we could do another podcast and dive a bit deeper into the subject or other subjects. But for now, anybody who's been listening, maybe we'll give an opportunity for people in the audience to ask questions. Does anyone have a question for Eggbased or in general?
So I'm wondering, because like when you've had these experiences, it sort of sets you apart from other people, because however real it is, someone who hasn't had these experiences don't understand how strange and real they feel, right? So you, Eggbase, had mentioned something about, like, at least the sensation of some sort of, revelation. Would you mind sharing what those were?
So that's a very interesting inquiry. Give me just a moment.
Okay.
I'm just going to absorb that question. So the difficult thing is that I feel as though, not that I shouldn't, but that I can't tell you much of anything that would be useful or even of substance, because most of the, as I would hesitate to describe it, personal revelations are of or related to myself. And I think that's, it could be part and parcel of bipolar, or it could also be a genuine spiritual interaction, which many people are not capable of or predisposed to. So to sort of describe them categorically, I would frequently experience something, and it would carry with it almost a message of infinite weight, which I still carry with me. And it was almost as though I was being taught those most profound lessons of life without having fully experienced them. Being gifted with wisdom without having earned it. And I suppose, to give you the most frustrating answer I could possibly muster, the only way for you to truly understand the things which were told to me, or which my subconscious invented, would be to listen to the things that I say. Right. So I'm not really sure how else to answer your question. That is genuinely the best I can do, and I'm sorry for that.
No, that's I get it. I get it. Very personal revelation and whatnot, right?
Yeah, certainly my experience has been, it's a massive struggle. I realize you haven't had perhaps the same extent or the same kind of sort of psychosis type experiences that can happen with extended sleep deprivation and mania, as I certainly have at times. So it may not be quite as bizarre. I'm not sure, but it's almost impossible to explain or describe or talk about, these quote unquote spiral code episodes and some of the seemingly mystical or supernatural insights or things that happen. And memories get confused, but it's kind of like describing a dream or something. It's very hard to properly articulate, I find.
Yes, and I don't mean to say that I've never had those. I mean, like, for instance, there was at some point a very large amount of cocaine, and during such time, I was exposed to a great many states of consciousness, which I would describe as either transcendental or profoundly psychotic. And I did indeed visit a great number of places other than the one which I am capable of consciously experiencing. And those experiences, I think, are still valuable, while I do not hold them in any sincere regard as realistic or communicable, per se.
Right. Thank you. Did anybody else have a question they wanted to ask?
Yeah, I have a question. Being in a manic episode, right? How does that compare to any of the drugs you've taken, like experientially?
That's a good question. If I understand you correctly, you're sort of looking for the equation for like a synthetic manic episode.
Yes.
Well, I couldn't precisely tell you, but mostly because I think there's some X factor to mania, which literally is akin to a possession. And it is a possession of oneself by oneself, which I believe is, insofar as it is unique to every individual, it is also the opposite of the depressive state that comes with bipolar, especially bipolar 1, which I have. Mania is similar to now, of course, I would compare it personally to a large amount of crystal methamphetamine. However, my experience of mania has not been like that. Most people I've encountered who are extremely manic and psychotic seem as though they have recently consumed a large amount of crystal meth. But my manic experience has been something between cocaine and MDMA in terms of analogy. And having experienced both those substances often at the same time, I can tell you that that is my most accurate representation that I could offer you.
Yeah, thank you.
You have a sense of hyper confidence, hyper euphoria, hyper energy, almost no need to sleep, or sleep is an impossibility, or like Eggbased said, you will feel like you have a superpower where you do not require sleep. Sometimes also food, even water, and you can become hyper social, hyper trusting, just like willing to go anywhere, do anything, chasing highs, very hedonistic, sometimes spending money, all that stuff that Eggbased described. I really like how you phrased it, and I'm glad that you mentioned the strange similarities to possession too, which is one of the strange things about it. And I think you said, mania is like a possession of yourself by yourself, which I think is a very interesting way to look at it. And I mean, I literally questioned quite heavily, not only during my first manic episode, but just of all of them, was there times that were literally possession? Is there truly some aspect of, sometimes you feel like you're being contacted by some other intelligence. Other times you feel like some other intelligence is, behind the wheels of your own personality or body. It's very bizarre, right? It's an experience that seems to have spiritual connotations, like you said. There's many overlaps and similarities, things I can relate to in what you described of your experience. But probably that would have to be a whole other podcast for me to kind of get into it in detail. But that being said,
Well,
is there
let's do
anyone?
that sometime.
Yeah, for sure. Is there anyone else who had a question?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Um, what kind of things would trigger you to have a psychosis or mania, I guess, or manic episode?
That's a profoundly psychiatric question. Um, Now, I'm very new to this, of course. I'm 23 years old. I was diagnosed in August, and I, I don't quite know what triggers mania. What I do know is that the trigger for my mania recently was my lack of supervision combined with my extremely high grade of pay, and feeling as though I had money and no one to tell me how to spend it was what I believe set it off the first time. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I mean, I think there is a weird feedback loop with having a lot of money and being in a manic episode where, yeah, it's like the manic episode can make you spend a lot of money, but having a lot of money can also feed into that. It's also strange, like with the drugs, right? Because people who have manic episodes will usually start compulsively doing drugs, smoking a lot, drinking a lot of caffeine, spending a lot of money. So there's this feedback loop where it's almost like you start uh, I think most of my manic episodes probably start on like a payday, for example, because you start by going to buy something that raises your dopamine or makes you feel good, which everything does, right? Shopping, spending money, all of that, and then you start chasing the next high, and it becomes this like treadmill effect or escalating cycle. But to answer your question just another way, in general, manic episodes are going to be triggered by things like stress, trauma. The major thing is sleep deprivation. That for me is definitely the number one cause. Is just sleep deprivation. Not eating enough can definitely play into that, and definitely any kind of stimulants like caffeine, cocaine, any kind of stimulants, drugs is going to potentially trigger that as well. But also, I found that extreme trauma or extreme stress can definitely also play a role in that.
Yeah, there's a huge correlation between bipolar, especially bipolar aggression, and low blood sugar. So it's sort of like a mental diabetes, or like one really has to eat, or it begins to produce psychological symptoms in a way that quote unquote normal people do not experience.
Right. Maybe we'll open it up one more time. Did anyone else want to ask a question?
Yeah, may I? Yeah, may I?
Please.
You feel like subconsciously by voluntarily admitting yourself to a ward, did you think that would solve it? Because talking about it now and thinking about it, in hindsight, I don't know if it's worked yet, but it sounds like you're on a good start. It sounds like you're on a good path. Like this is a really healthy start.
Well, thank you, Ryder. Solved is a terrible word. There's a family history. My great uncle, for instance, my maternal grandmother's brother, had bipolar 1. And he was described by most of my family as a quote, nutbag, unquote. And bipolar is something that one has or does not have. It is not an affliction which one cures. So I hesitate to say anything regarding the word solved. However, what I will say is that the parts of bipolar which most profoundly affected my life have been successfully abated by my recent course of medication. And I feel as though I am the best version of myself more of the time, if not all of the time, thanks to psychiatry. So I hope that is an answer in as much as it can be.
Yeah. And just to go ahead, do you want to say something, Ryder?
No, I just wanted to say yes, sir. That was a powerful response. Thank you.
And yeah, I just wanted to agree with and reiterate what Eggbased said. I mean, bipolar you have, it's permanent, can't be cured. And so it's sort of about learning how to live with it, which I've come to learn is sort of difficult to define, but definitely does seem to be sort of a skill to it, or maybe it's a knowledge that you gain, a self-awareness, more awareness of the condition. I'd like to believe that, as you get more familiar with the condition and with yourself, you can kind of manage it better. You can recognize signs and symptoms. You can potentially have more awareness about it and be on top of it. But that is somewhat day by day experience for all bipolar people. And one of the crazy things about it is like you could be lucid for a long period of time, potentially years or even more than a decade, or you could have another completely overwhelming manic episode in principle at any time, even if you were on medication, although it's obviously a lot less likely in that case. But they will say bipolar is both the most dangerous mental illness to have statistically, because the rate of suicide is very high, the rate of premature death is very high, can cause very dangerous behavior, such as some of what you've described and some that you hopefully haven't experienced. But at the same time, it has one of the best prognoses when treated, and a lot of very successful and very creative people have the condition. And actually, it's, as I'm sure you're probably aware, it's a condition that bipolar is a condition that's directly associated with high intelligence and high creativity, and particularly people with very high verbal IQ. And I know that you are certainly fit that typical profile of a very intelligent person, has very high verbal intelligence, which is also my strongest area of intelligence. And I find it quite interesting how there's this direct correlation between verbal intelligence and bipolar. It's a very strange condition, but long story short, there's a very good prognosis if you treat it, and as you have done. So I guess that brings me to maybe one of my last questions, which is, what are you looking at in terms of your future? What are going to be your main priorities now as you've gotten out of the hospital recently? Presumably you'll have some time before going back to work. So what are you planning to sort of focus on or focus your time on while you have, recuperate?
Well, I plan to be doubly employed by Wednesday. And my goal is basically to work rather demeaningly, probably for slightly above minimum wage, while I spread widely my CV and try and get back into a more stable sales position with probably base pay and health insurance, perhaps a pay ceiling a bit lower than what I was previously used to, but some more stability and warm leads and such things. Because being a what's the word? A wheeling and dealing, slick handshaking salesman is one thing. I'd like to have a job that I could do for many years without having to interface with an office full of coke addicts. So that is my long-term goal, is to work in a sales position where I can still exercise my talent, and I say talent very confidently, my talent for sales, without being exposed to an unstable or temptation-ridden environment, which is likely to send me back into mania. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a good plan. Very reasonable. I don't know your situation, obviously, but generally it's conceded that there's usually a period of time, usually longer than what you spend in the hospital, sometimes a few times longer, of post-hospital recovery before you would usually try to go back to work. But obviously, yourself, but I'm just saying, don't necessarily rush into it. Don't hesitate to take some time to just, recuperate, because what, as you said, what goes up must come down to some extent, and all that hyper energetic mental activity and all that not sleeping and all those drugs in that case, it's going to presumably take a little while to rebalance your brain. And
with respect to what you said, I'll remind you, si Deus nobiscum, quis contra nos? If God is with us, who can be against us?
Amen. And well said. So, yeah, is there anything else you wanted to talk about or discuss, or should we wrap it up on that note?
I'd be open to one more question, if there's one more question. Otherwise, we can wrap it up.
All right, we'll turn that to the room first. Does anyone have one more question for Mr. Eggbased? All right. Yeah.
No, I don't. I'm
Okay.
not going to ask.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you sharing, Eggbased. I can certainly relate to everything you've been through on many different levels. Obviously, I have total confidence you'll, not only make a full recovery, but achieve all the goals that you set for yourself in the future. Obviously, highly intelligent, talented person. And I really appreciate you sharing your experience. Hopefully, it will be helpful for anyone who has been listening or who might in the future experience some kind of mental health or hospitalization. One thing I think is great about this community is it's a place where we can share these experiences, be around a lot of other people who've had similar experiences, and benefit from each other's experiences and to support each other in living with various states of mental health. And I think it really does a lot when people share their experiences openly like this. I know a lot of people have shared that with me, that it's been very helpful for them, to realize how many people go through these things. And so I just want to thank you again for coming on, for sharing. I do think we could probably do another podcast on this, building on the foundation we've laid here and getting into maybe some more experiences. But I think this is great. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry it was a couple days postponed. But yeah, thanks again for your time.
Certainly, much appreciated, sir, and it means a lot coming from you. I'm rather happy to consider you not only a friend, but also an individual from whom I have much to learn. And I would be humbled if this recording had any value to anyone in a similar position to mine, or not. But I sincerely hope that it does. And thank you again.
The feelings are entirely mutual. I'm sure it will be helpful. And again, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Eggbased, for sharing. And we will definitely discuss these subjects more, both in and outside of further podcasts. So that being said, thanks again, everybody. We will be resuming regular podcasts from this point on, I think, aiming for 8 p.m. every day, Central Time. Tomorrow, maybe with Crimson Raven, we'll talk about the 5D universe and some new age and spiritual topics, if that works for him. Otherwise, just keep an eye on the announcements channel for what's always coming up. And thank you again, everybody, for joining me. Find this on the Temple Mount Discord server, Temple Mount Podcast on YouTube and BitChute. That being said, good night, everybody, and God bless.